All right. Well, hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of Summer Fundraising. It's great to be here with so many of you and so wonderful to see so many of you saying hello in the chat box already. My name is Vanessa Chase Lakshan, and for those of you who don't know me, I run a website called The Storytelling Nonprofit, where I help organizations use narrative to tell stories about the great work that they're doing. And today here on Summer Fundraising, I have a wonderful guest who I'm really excited to introduce to you all, Creedy, who's a prospect researcher, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in just a second. In the meantime, I just wanted to let you all know about a couple of quick housekeeping items. So many of you are joining us here in Crowdcast, which is fantastic. Welcome. It's really easy to interact with us in the chat box. And if you have questions, as we have a conversation here today about women's philanthropy, we'd love for you to ask those. You can send them in to us using either the chat box or just below this video screen. There's a big red button that says submit questions, and you can also use that as well. For those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, you're welcome to join us over on Crowdcast. If you'd like to get in on the conversation and discussion, you can go to crowdcast.io/Vanessa E. Chase, and you'll see a listing for the event there. So I'm really excited, as I said, to introduce Creedy. I feel like this is a wonderful extension on some of the conversations we've had so far this summer on summer fundraising, and an interesting take on diversity and inclusion in philanthropy. So Creedy is the manager of prospect development at St. Paul's Hospital Foundation here in Vancouver, which is where I'm based as well. She provides research advice, strategy, and more for a small, mighty team of campaign and major gift fundraisers. Their plan is to build a new hospital on a new site in downtown Vancouver. Creedy has been doing prospect research for the last 15 years, working in a variety of fund development shops, including higher education, community foundation movement, and library systems, and now healthcare. In her spare time, she studies women donors, and both at her organization and at a larger scale, determined to put more women in the prospect research portfolios everywhere. Welcome, Creedy.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Vanessa. I'm so excited and so honored to be asked to talk to you and your audience. I've been admiring your work for a number of years, and I was actually thinking about the first time that we met, and I'm pretty sure it was Ms. Rubbed, which was a sort of female fundraiser talking circle that a couple of our peers started a number of years ago. So it's kind of neat to sort of carry on the conversation about fundraising and women's philanthropy. It all sort of ties in together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that might have been it. I don't know if our paths ever crossed at UBC, because I think you and I were both there, maybe at different times though.
We were, yes, we were. I remember you were in annual and I was in research, and a lot of great silos over at UBC.
That's true.
So I don't think
that's what happens in higher education philanthropy.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm really excited to have you here today to talk about women's philanthropy. I think this is such an interesting category of giving, and one that's, I feel like, talked about sometimes, but for the most part, we just focus on philanthropy as a broad category. So I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about, what drives your interest in women's philanthropy, and why is that such a passion for you in your prospect research?
Yeah, big question for sure. I would say that, from the moment that I started sort of having to identify new prospects for my organization right from the start, I had to get creative about what sort of donor segments to sort of focus on. And I was finding that a lot of the people that I was asked to research did happen to be sort of, corporate white men, and I hope that doesn't, I hope that isn't offensive to people to say that, because I really did notice, me being who I am, and knowing that there are demographics out there that, there's a lot of diversity in Vancouver and in our province. So how can we get, those donors and prospects into our prospect portfolios? But really, there was a formative kind of experience I had when I was working at a community foundation here locally. We had a transformational donor give to us. She made this gift that was, I believe it was about 40 million to a number of charities, but our charity received $35 million of that. And she was a woman named Judith Jardine. And the organization, while very grateful and wanting to acknowledge her spirit and her gift, we didn't at the time know who she was. We didn't know anything about her. She didn't have a record in our database. I don't believe there was any information in our files. We checked with our staff and our board, but no one seemed to know her. And so being in prospect research and prospect development, it's kind of disheartening to sort of, have your most sort of generous transformational donor present themselves after life and then not know, who she is. And it struck me that, as I'm sort of researching all of these sort of, corporate white men, and we're trying to engage them in giving, we've got this sort of outlier, a female donor who we don't seem to know a lot about. So it struck me, it was a really formative moment for me. And that's when I decided that I was going to, talk about it more, that I was going to blog about it and sort of be a bit more sort of open about, engaging other people in that discussion about women's philanthropy. So that's how it started.
And it's funny, I remember that gift from Judith, and I remember it being in the papers and pretty widely covered because people were just so surprised at both the generosity of the gift and also how under the radar she had been as a donor, a major donor in the communities. And you hear stories like that, but I feel like they're sort of the unicorns of philanthropy stories, because most often organizations, you're right, do know who their prospects are. They work very hard to know who those people are and be able to kind of cultivate those relationships. So,
yeah, for sure. And I'm not really sure what happened in this particular case. I think it was a case of Judith, just sort of deliberately wanting to be under the radar and not wanting to be acknowledged. So anyway, so that's how it all sort of started for me.
That's wonderful. So I want to get into a little bit more of kind of the nitty gritty around women's philanthropy. And I'd love to talk about the idea of gender bias, both in fundraising and philanthropy. So as a prospect researcher, I know you primarily deal in data. Can you share some of the challenges and also you think some of the opportunities to increase gender data and enhance fundraising practices within organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to, fundraising by or from female donors, it's really important to be intentional and deliberate. So, really sort of trying to understand who your donor base of support is. So segmenting by gender may be a really good start for an organization who's looking to sort of, engage more female prospects. Some of the challenges that I've had with data is that they're simply not present in our database. Oftentimes their spouses or their men have, a database record, and, oftentimes gifts are actually tracked under the men, but the women's contribution is not always sort of clear. It's not always documented and tracked. So there's definitely opportunity there to sort of strengthen our understanding of how families work and tracking that in our database. And there's also, so there's gift data. There's sort of also the idea that women tend to volunteer first. They tend to present themselves as volunteers. And volunteer data is not necessarily something that always makes its way into your database. I know that especially at small organizations where we're trying so hard to track KIPS data, that we don't always have time to track our prospects and our volunteers. But women tend to volunteer first, and they tend to volunteer for a long time before they present themselves as donors. And when they are giving, the tendency is to give smaller amounts first and kind of build that trust with an organization. And then, eventually maybe even be the next Judith Jardine by giving away, their life's earnings and
I've never heard that statistic before, or the kind of the correlation around women tending to be volunteers first. But I think about some of the women donors I've known over the years, and even my mom, who, excuse me, excuse me, just gonna grab a sip of water.
Yeah, sure. So am I.
Pardon me. So I was going to say, even my mom, who by no means is a major donor, but she's volunteered for years with the SPCA in Sacramento and a few other organizations. And that's certainly one of the ways I think that's, for her really meaningful to be involved and to give back to the community.
Right. Yeah. And there's also, even going beyond volunteering, there's the whole notion of women, joining nonprofit boards and sort of serving organizations that way, which I think is really important. It's actually formed part of the freelance work I've done for a couple of organizations out there now who are really keen to, add more women to their boards so that we can sort of foster our understanding of their networks and begin to understand who are the power women in our city, or even who are the under the radar women who want to get more involved because they care. So yeah. So there's that, and also, sorry, just sort of kind of, I wanted to stress in major gift fundraising in particular, I think there's a tendency. And I'm kind of stereotyping here, so you can stop me if I'm wrong. But I think in major gift fundraising, it's easy to go down the road of, going to your existing network. So going to the existing sort of corporate men on your board, going to their networks, and then sort of seeing from that pool of prospects who's actually interested in your organization. But it's kind of more methodical. It's kind of like you identify a prospect, you take that prospect out to lunch, at the Vancouver Club, and then you eventually get around to presenting a formal proposal with a dollar amount, and then, someone's name gets put on the wall kind of thing. And that's sort of traditional major gift fundraising. And I'm not sure that women, we really see a lot of women presenting themselves that way. So that's why I stress sort of, volunteering, like finding your volunteers who are really interested in your cause, and maybe taking a look at your sort of loyal annual donors as well, and segmenting by gender. So just want to put that out there as well as another sort of like bias I've seen in the way that major gift fundraising is done.
Well, I think you were telling me there was a really interesting statistic about how much or what percentage of the world wealth women control. And I wondered if you could share that and sort of talk about how that plays in or factors into the bias that we might have around this.
Right. Yeah. So I was telling you, Vanessa, that I didn't want to bombard our audience today with a bunch of statistics about women in wealth, but I do have actually one really important stat that I got. I was at the Women's Philanthropy Institute Symposium in Chicago earlier this spring, and I was just trying to pick up some intel and do a little bit of networking. It was a really interesting conference, and there were a lot of power women there. But Indiana Women's Philanthropy Institute just about says it all. Women control 30% of global wealth, and I think that's kind of all we need to know when it comes to making the case for pursuing, female donors and prospects. So, yeah.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'm sure for a long time that's been underestimated too, I would imagine, with organizations
absolutely
traditionally pursuing male donors.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a time when women couldn't even sort of own property, and now we're entrepreneurs and we're independent. There's another stat I read that unmarried women in America make like half of all charitable bequests in the States, and that is from Merrill Lynch, I believe, a financial institution. The financial institutions are really great at studying women because they're looking for new clients. And so, so we can definitely draw from them to glean some more information for our own sort of prospect
That's really
pools.
interesting. So as you were talking about boards and sort of the composition of boards and, traditionally having a lot of men on boards and sort of that dynamic, I was thinking about my own board experience, which I feel like has primarily been an anomaly in what most people experience as a board member. I'm on the board of the Rape Crisis Center, which for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a feminist rape crisis center here in Vancouver. And because they're such a women-focused organization, they have an internal policy of only allowing women on the board and women volunteers within the organization. And I was thinking about how that's kind of factored into their major gifts prospect research. And I don't know if it has, because they do have kind of an interesting mix of both male and female donors to the organization. But it definitely, I'm sure, probably affects how we as board members prospect, since it's our own networks that are coming into the organization most often. I'm definitely going to think about that some more, because I think that's probably a very different dynamic and situation than from what a lot of boards will experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I wonder, we don't want to sort of like lump all sort of, females into thinking that they're only going to identify other females for charitable causes. But I would imagine that you probably do, like as a female, have like-minded, friends and colleagues who kind of care about the same causes that you do. And it kind of brings up another point that women don't only support other women's organizations. I mean, they support all kinds of organizations. But there is a study out of TD that has shown that women tend to support only 2 to 3 causes, even though those causes tend to be quite diverse. So they do kind of tend to stay loyal to particular organizations. So I think that's, again, something to keep in mind, but that's really interesting.
And I guess even thinking about my own experience as a donor, I would say that's true. I've been pretty loyal to a smaller number of organizations, but they are pretty diverse. And for those of you who are listening, I think we so often kind of exclude ourselves from, what a donor might look like or what our own experiences giving might be. But I'd really encourage you to think about your own giving habits or your own sort of giving patterns. And, if that's sort of in alignment with what we've been talking about. And maybe you're more similar than you think to some of those donors that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that me as a donor, I mean, I really don't give a lot every year, but I am only looking at maybe 2 or 3 organizations every year that I'm kind of loyal to, that I want to give to. And I really only started giving to St. Paul's, my current organization, when I started working here, and I started learning about the story of St. Paul's, and it's really gripped me. So that would be another point, is to really try to not sell your story, but really share your story in sort of emotive and authentic ways for your female donor base. I think that's really important. And the time frames are long, Vanessa. The time frames are long when it comes to women. So they're probably going to be in your prospect pool for a number of years, if not decades. And I know that organizations are fixated in sort of their annual targets, right? They've got a certain number of dollars they need to raise every year. And women may not sort of make those major gifts during life, or even in the first sort of 12 to 18 months of knowing them. But I think being patient is the way to go. I think sort of taking a look at your donor base as if they are donors for life, and not only donors annually, is going to help you understand your female donor base as well.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice too, more broadly with major gifts. People often, I think especially from annual giving, will think it's sort of this instantaneous, sort of instant gratification of giving, but it really is such a long game sometimes. And I think the more organizations take the long view of it, oftentimes the more successful they are, because they're committed to being persistent and cultivating those relationships over time, rather than just a short amount of time and then feeling like they haven't gotten anywhere and sort of abandoning a strategy that may have actually been working for them, right?
Yeah. And you bring up a good point, because like being a prospect development professional, being in prospect research, I think it's really our job to help you understand your donor base for that sort of long game, for that longer term, really getting to know who your donor is on paper and understanding their family dynamics. Just knowing where they come from will just help you cultivate that relationship further. And I think it's really important that when it comes to women to sort of know who they are and get to know them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so interesting so far, Creedy, and I'm wondering if you would mind if we go to some of the audience questions, because we have a few that I think are really fascinating that would be great for us to talk about. Okay.
Sure.
So Francis asked if there are any sort of specific messages or maybe even messaging themes that tend to resonate more with women than men. And I wonder if you've seen anything sort of kind of through lines or commonalities in some of the research you've done at different types of organizations.
Oh, that's really interesting. I would say that if you're an organization and you're taking a look at your communication material and you're trying to talk to women, maybe have some women on those brochures or online sort of, present at your organization, so that like other women can actually see that there are other females at this organization doing great works. I think that's really powerful. But aside from that, I haven't done a thorough amount of research in that area. I have come across the fact that women sort of they tend to attach themselves emotionally to organizations and causes. So maybe really using that emotive language that speaks from the heart, maybe using language that is a bit more vulnerable than you may use with a man might make sense. I know it certainly speaks to me when people are sort of real and direct in their appeals.
Yeah, likewise.
So
it's interesting. I mean, I've done a lot of donor surveys for organizations. I haven't done any sort of broad study over multiple organizations, so I don't necessarily know, Francis, if I have a good answer for you around what resonates with women more broadly. I would say, though, that I definitely agree with you, Creedy, that I think that concept of social proof and engaging a variety of voices and diversity in communications and in fundraising is a really important thing, because for people to see themselves or someone like themselves in communications or in stories is often such good social proof that they feel like someone like them with their values or their world beliefs or their own views is also engaged in this organization. And so it might be something that they also feel comfortable engaging with or want to continue to engage with, can often be very motivating, I think, to donors and audiences that you might be trying to reach.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Let's see. Just going to scroll down here. So Brooke asked a really interesting question. And her question is, what, if any, role can a fundraising event play in women's philanthropy? Events are so visible, so it makes sense that a golf versus luncheon events might attract and signal something very different to female donors. What do you think event fundraisers should consider if they're thinking about having events for their organization?
Oh gosh, wow, you guys are really sort of, getting me with these big questions. I'm a prospect researcher, so I'm trained to sort of look at linkages and interest and ability. But I think, in terms of events, like really, there's this popular concept of the giving circle, women giving in terms of sort of like coming together and talking about the issue or talking about a cause in a really equal and sort of free way, and actually contributing however much they possibly can to a giving circle. So that might be one sort of concept to try to explore further. I know there are female giving circles at a handful of community foundations in Canada and in the States. There are also giving circles that are forming around cultural groups. So there's a really amazing giving circle out in New York. It's the Asian Women's Giving Circle. I would encourage you to take a look at them on Twitter. They have apparently raised like close to $800,000 or since inception for arts organizations, for like small arts organizations in the New York City area. So definitely, I think when you're thinking about events is to kind of think about the collaborative aspect of giving. Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
That is. I mean, I can also speak to this from the small amount of event fundraising experience that I've had, which is definitely that you do have to consider the audience that you're trying to reach. And probably the best example I can give you is when I was running a monthly giving program here in Vancouver a number of years ago. We were really focused on sort of individual donors who were giving monthly. Typically, we assumed they were over the age of 60 and they were married, possibly widowed. They were later in their life stage. And so their giving priorities and giving reasons were a bit different than someone who is of a younger demographic. But when we actually did some research and surveying of that group, we actually found out that the average age of our monthly donor was something like 43 years old, and they were typically married and already had one child. And when we asked them what their primary motivation was for being a monthly donor, a lot of people said that one of the reasons they were giving was that they wanted to involve their family in philanthropy and also teach their children about philanthropy. And that information was really important to us because we would frequently organize stewardship events for monthly donors, usually 2 or 3 times a year. And before, we had never really thought about, well, how can we make it a family-oriented event, involve, kids and their parents, and make it a real fun learning opportunity for everyone, and also make it an opportunity to appreciate the donors. And that little bit of data drastically changed our strategy around that for the better. It's an example of, I think, how kind of digging into your own audience and doing this kind of research might be able to help you as well, Brooke.
Absolutely. Nice.
All right. So Stacy has a question here. She says, I'm thinking about family dynamics and most women handle money matters. Would you think that it's important when dealing with male donors that you also build a relationship with the spouse? And how could one do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh. That's really what I'm always trying to encourage our fundraisers here at St. Paul's to sort of take a look at. I've often said that take a look at your sort of top 10 donors at your organization and now turn to their women, because those are the donors and prospects that you definitely want to try to understand, because oftentimes they're making like giving decisions together, right? We have that intel out of Indiana as well. The Women's Philanthropy Institute has done a number of studies called Women Give, and in their earlier years, around 2010, 2011, they really promoted the fact and unearthed that that females are oftentimes making giving decisions either on their own or they're definitely part of the couple's decision making. So in terms of doing a bit more engagement, well, here at St. Paul's, I have found that in order to engage our female donors better, I have had to have some, hard conversations with our female fundraisers and actually try to identify whether they're interested in engaging their female donors. And that has really helped, like kind of starting grassroots, starting on the ground and sort of seeing who we can actually engage at the annual level, at the sort of lower major gift level. I think that's really important. I'm not sure if that really answers the question.
It's definitely the first half of that question. And I think I can speak to the second half of it, which is more around how do you actually do that? So Stacey, I have a couple thoughts for you on how to actually do that. So when I worked with major donors a couple of years ago and some of the clients that I work with now, one of the things that's often a great idea is to, in the process of getting to know people, is get to know a little bit more about sort of that dynamic. So, you could ask, do you make giving decisions on your own? Do you, have a spouse or partner who helps you sort of think through these things? Asking those sorts of questions and being straightforward about it can certainly give you the answers to that. If you don't feel comfortable just kind of coming outright and asking those kinds of questions, you can also just think about opportunities where you can invite spouses to things. So if there's an event, encourage your donors to bring their spouse. If you're meeting them for coffee or you're planning a visit of some kind, invite their spouse. They may not necessarily think to invite them themselves, but sometimes if you open that invitation, they'll bring them along as well, especially if they are already involved in the giving decisions. It's a great opportunity for them to meet you or someone else at your organization. All right, so I think we have a couple of other questions here that were of interest. So Andrew asked, in addressing communications, has there been any research done about placing women's names before the husband's or partner's names, and does that affect donation rates?
Yeah, I only really have anecdotal evidence about that. I've heard in giving a number of presentations on this topic before that just sort of flipping that salutation and addressing the woman first in terms of in your letters or even, contact by phone can really sort of, enhance the conversation and sort of get you in the door. I've had a woman tell me that she was accustomed to talking to donors and thanking them, and she would just ask for Mr. Smith, and she wouldn't really sort of take the time to say can I talk to Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith and sort of keep the conversation going. And she found that by not being biased and sort of only thanking the man when she's on the phone, thanking for a gift, that when she took the time to actually sort of try to understand who was on the other line, and if that was a female voice, she would sort of, keep talking and keep going. She found that really enhanced her ability to kind of thank her donors.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I don't think I've seen any research on it affecting donation rates. And I'm going to guess, Andrew, that you're wondering more about annual giving type donation rates. So if it was like an appeal letter or something like that. I do think that it's always best practice to figure out the best way to address your donors. So if you did any sort of survey, which, is often a great tool to gather some of this information, asking people about their preferences for the salutation is a really great thing to do. So asking them, should we just address you by your first name? Would you like you and your partner to be addressed more formally or, by both of your first names? Inquire about that, ask people, and then you can customize that data a little bit more and make it more personal in some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I just had a bit of a sort of thought as well around salutations in your database. So if there are still sort of records in your database where there's Miss, M-I-S-S, or Ms. or Mrs., really segmenting your data by salutation, if you have the ability to do that, could unearth some really interesting prospects, because I would imagine that you don't really call yourself Miss Pretty Gill anymore. I used to when I was younger, but I would imagine that if you have a couple of misses in your database, they might be older women that you want to pursue. Our demographics in our province are certainly trending towards an increase in the population of single boomer women. And those are the very women who are probably going to make, large charitable plan gifts to organizations, especially if they're the last in their family line, or, if they care about the causes they're currently volunteering at or they're currently involved in. So, yeah, so there's that.
So Creedy, I think we have 2 questions left that I'd like for us to answer, if that's okay with you, and then we'll do a little wrap up here and let everyone get on with their day. And so Shannon had a question, and I think this is probably more about gender bias within an organization and not necessarily fundraising or philanthropy itself, but it might be worth answering. So she said, okay. This topic around women's giving has been an issue that's top of mind right now for her. So her question is, do you find that faith-based boards and predominantly male executive staffs within a faith-based nonprofit harder to work with? If so, what's the best way to begin to break down some of those barriers and successfully bring more diversity and balance along with establishing yourself as a strong leader or executive while not being stereotyped?
Wow. Well, that's a question that may take decades to answer, let me tell you. But I mean, I can share that, you know, I'm actually at an organization now, St. Paul's. We are actually a faith-based organization. All of, primarily our senior management is made up of white men, and you know, they know that there's opportunities to engage like females and opportunities to engage people from other sort of cultural backgrounds for sure. It is a shift in mindset. I do think I'm going to bring up that point again of sort of if you're at an organization at that grassroots level, really trying to find your peers who are like interested in sort of advancing diversity and inclusion at your organization, really starting there would be a good starting point. You know, do a little bit of donor segmentation. Does it make sense to incorporate more sort of board candidates from a particular sort of cultural persuasion? Does it make sense to sort of add more women to your board? I think it does, but I think senior management would probably want to see some hard numbers in terms of how many female donors do you have and what are their giving levels, that type of thing. And it is grassroots. I don't think that you're going to be successful if you go straight to the top and say, hey, you know what, I don't see a lot of women on our board and that has to change. I can also share that there have been our new board chair, our incoming board chair is female, is Catherine, and she's an amazing soul. I know that she's a feminist on the inside, and she wants to see our organization diversify as well. So I think having her as an advocate is going to like change things. It's going to be definitely change making. And there are primarily more men than there are women on our board, but our senior management has helped propel our, you know, sole female to that board chair role. So I think that's really significant.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I have to say, Shannon, I don't necessarily know if it's, you know, that the case that, you know, faith-based organizations have more challenges with this or not. I think it's probably across the board. You know, all organizations face, I think, challenges in some degree with regards to gender bias and things like that. You know, I was thinking about some advice that Simone Joyo shared with me recently about one of the most powerful things that we can do as nonprofit professionals is unlearn our own privilege and identify our own biases. And this might be an opportunity to do that within your organization and have conversations around that with people. And I think what Creedy suggested around, you know, thinking strategically about how this fits into your philanthropy goals and being able to invite more of those people into your donor base or into your board seats might be one of those ways to make some small steps towards that.
Right.
All right, so I wanted to just end with this question from Emily, which I thought was an interesting one. And she asked, how would you suggest reaching out, to older women, such as the one who left a large gift to the Vancouver Foundation? Gifting from estate plans are something that our organization is thinking more and more about and would like to pursue. So.
Yeah, I would again stress taking a look at your volunteers and sort of seeing if you can pinpoint who are the aging women in your volunteer base of support, and making sure that they're always being thanked and that they're being appealed to. I think that would be a really important sort of step to take for sure. Growing your planned giving donor base. Wow, that's a really sort of big question as well.
I mean, I can give
tips
that I have around that that I've used with a couple of organizations. It's worked well. And it's probably not going to be a surprise to any of you because I've mentioned this already, which is surveys. And when I've done audience research and surveys in the past, one of the questions, or actually two of the questions that we'll often include if it's a survey to try to prospect some gift and estate donors, is to ask people, one of the questions will be, did you know that we have gift and estate planning options for our donors? Just to understand if people know about that, and being able to understand if your current marketing is effective. That's a great way to gauge that. And then the secondary question that we'll often ask is, would you like more information about this? And that's often a very easy way to get a foot in the door with people who can self-identify as prospects, and then you can follow up with them. And it's not pushy. They've already said they're interested. And it can be a great way for you to start those conversations with people.
Yeah, and I would also say from a data standpoint, I know it's hard data, like it's difficult data to try to capture, but if you can somehow learn more about the ages of your actual donor base, you'll then be able to sort of go in, years later and segment by gender and by age, and kind of find who your prospects and donors are that way. So there's always sort of good data management, good data capture, using creative means.
Fantastic. Well, Creedy, it's been such a delight to have you here today talking about women's philanthropy. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you if you had any final words or resources that you'd like to share with folks.
Yeah, well, you guys have asked a lot of really great sort of, big picture questions that I'm hoping will sort of, keep carrying the conversation forward. Of course, there aren't really a lot of straight answers, but I did want to point your attention again to my blog, because I've been working on it quite a bit lately. There's a couple of pages there if you want to check it out. It's diversitydrivendata.blog. There's a couple of pages I've been working on. The first is Lady Links, and that is actually a list of resources, primarily prospect research and sort of mainstream media sites where you can go and sort of learn about influential women, learn about women's wealth. I also have a number of studies I referenced from the banks, the financial institutions, and academic studies as well. They're all sort of handily linked there, so you can check out Lady Links. And also, because I think if you see more women donors, then you're going to start to think about female donors more. I've also started a sort of donor roll. It's called Donations at the Diva Level. And that's a place where I actually monitor media, and I look for gifts given by women, either like living or after they've passed on through their estates. And so there's sort of a donor role there of females and the gifts they've made to organizations, primarily in North America, but also throughout the world. And I'm going to be updating that on a consistent basis as I can. So I'm, kind of proud about sort of helping, sort of track some of this women's philanthropy that is happening right now, and to have some concrete examples and concrete resources to draw from, I think is a really good starting point when it comes to increasing women's philanthropy in our sector. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Vanessa, for, you know, all of the work that you've been doing in this area. I know that your focus has been on, your focus has certainly been on sort of empowering females in fundraising. And we certainly know that there's a lot of females doing great fundraising work. And so wouldn't it be great if we could sort of increase, you know, the number of female donors that we're engaging and soliciting and thanking on a day-to-day basis. That would be very empowering for our sector. So just wanted to...
Yeah, and I just wanted to let everyone know, I have included a couple of the links that Creedy mentioned in the chat box. And I also have a link to Creedy's website in the resource guide that I published today, actually. Which is sort of complementary, I think, to a lot of what we've been talking about. It's called A Woman's Guide to Thriving in Fundraising, and I'll also include a link to that in the chat box in case you'd like to check that out. I've included Creedy's blog as a really wonderful resource for research around diversity in women's philanthropy, and something that I think we could all probably use a little bit more of in our work. So thank you so much, Creedy, for joining us today. And thanks for everyone who tuned in. It's been a wonderful episode and a great conversation. We will have this recording available tomorrow over on the blog. So if you've enjoyed it and you'd like to share it with friends or colleagues in fundraising, we'd welcome you to do that and to continue to spread this message of elevating women's philanthropy in our communities. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.